Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part two as we look at the Christianities, two losers and one winner, even though the losers could have potentially been right in their Christology. But the group that we left off with, or really a collection of groups, was the Gnostics. And to say something more about the Gnostics before I move on, a lot of the Gnostics. Many of them were part of the Johannine community that helped produce the Gospel of John and the letters of John. And one of the reasons why that's shown is because their writing style is very, very similar. Um, I believe, I think, I'm thinking this is in First John. It's in one of the letters, but I believe in First John. The author talks about how they were once, one of us, part of us, and then they went in a totally different direction. To say something, regarding the Gospel of John with a lot of Gnostic teaching, the Gospel of John would, in many respects, be a perfect Gnostic gospel with, some exceptions, such as the notion of how the Word became flesh, or when Jesus is talking about the Eucharist, what's known as the bread of life discourse, where he mentions how my flesh is true food and my blood is true drink, there in the Gospel of John, referring to the bread and the wine. But moving on, um, for many of the Gnostics, the God of the Jews was an evil God, or if he was not evil, he was stupid or ignorant, while the God of Jesus was a good God. A lot of Gnostics held that the Jewish God, essentially the creator God of this world, was an evil being, or if he wasn't evil, he was stupid or ignorant. And one of the reasons why has to do with the issue of theodicy, the problem of evil. To give an example of one particular form of Gnosticism known as Sethian Gnostics and their work, The Secret Book of John, essentially what you have, kind of setting the story here, is that you have the father, and the father then begats a feminine version of himself called the mother, and then the two engage in sexual relations and they have a son, Jesus. And then within the heavenly realm, you have all these different aeons or gods. And the father essentially decides who is going to have sexual relations with whom. Well, one particular aeon, a goddess named Sophia, she decides that she wants to produce a child by asexual means and not through whom the father has designated to be her partner. Essentially what she wanted to do was do what the father did in begatting the mother. So she does this, and she produces a child that is described as having the face of a lion and the body of a serpent. And she names the child Ealdabaoth, which essentially translates to son of chaos. And Ealdabaoth is the creator god of this world. He's the god of Abraham. And he's described as being very quick tempered, very malicious. Um, one of the things he talks about is, I'm a jealous God, I'm the only God, etc. But eventually, a lot of the beings that he's created are like, well, if he's the only God, what does he have to be jealous of? Well, Jesus's purpose in coming down from the heavenly realm was essentially to liberate people from Yaldabaoth, the creator god of this world. And I mentioned how, many Gnostics would not have children because, from their perspective, having children essentially would keep people trapped in the world created by Yaldabaoth, the evil god. And of course, Jesus' mission was to get people away from Yaldabaoth and back to the Father, the true good God. And until 1945, what we mostly knew about the Gnostics was through the writings of their enemies. We always knew about them and their various works. Like, for example, what I just mentioned earlier about the secret book of John, we always knew about it because other people wrote about it. But the people that wrote about it were their enemies, which is going to be the group that's going to be mentioned in just a few moments. Well, then in 1945, we had what's known as the Nag Hammadi library discovery, where we, found these works and were able to read them on, their own terms. Whereas before, we'd always read, snippets of what, somebody else, usually Irenaeus, who was one of the early church fathers and Bishop of Lyon, his work against heresies, what he happened to say about them. But, now we could read them on their own terms. Well, of course, that's another one of the groups that lost, or collection of groups here that lost. So now we turn to Catholic Orthodox, the form that won, the winner. Catholic Orthodoxy, is the form of Christianity which ultimately won. All modern day Christians descend directly or indirectly from Catholic Orthodoxy. So, Catholic Orthodoxy, it's the form that ultimately won. All modern day Christians descend directly or indirectly from Catholic Orthodoxy. I mean, if you're Catholic or you're Orthodox, you have very direct connection with this group, as this, of course, was the United Catholic Orthodox Church until, keeping it simple here, they split in 1054, what's known as the Great Schism. But, if you are, say, Lutheran, you would have perhaps more of a direct connection because the Lutheran Church comes out of the Catholic Church. If you're a Methodist, more of an indirect connection as the Methodist Church comes out of the Church of England, which comes out of the Catholic Church. But even if you belong to, say, the Restoration Movement, which is a variety of different groups, you would still be more theologically in line with Catholic Orthodoxy than with, say, the adoptionists slash Ebionites or the Gnostics. Well, Catholic Orthodoxy, it produced the Bible as we would conceive of it and the historic Christian creeds, such as the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed. So the Bible, as we would conceive of it, is part of the Catholic Orthodox tradition. The canon, of the Bible, as we would conceive of it, in this case, the New Testament, coming from Athanasius of Alexandria, who was a bishop in the Catholic Orthodox movement. Um, and of course, the historic Christian creeds, the Apostles' Creed and the Nicene Creed, and there's also the Athanasian Creed. But, essentially the notion of how, Jesus was born of a virgin, Jesus was God incarnate, et cetera, et cetera. And from the Catholic Orthodox position, the adoptionist slash Ebionites and the Gnostics were heretics. And, again, Catholic Orthodoxy, that's the form that won, the other side's lost. So, yeah, they're the heretics. Now, obviously, the adoptionists slash Ebionites and the Gnostics, depending on which form, could have conceivably been right, but they lost in this. And Catholic Orthodoxy won. So, from their perspective, the the adoptionists and the Gnostics were the heretics. I mentioned how St. Paul, in his writing to the letter to the Galatians, he refers to the adoptionists slash Ebionites as the Judaizers because, they are basically stating that, Christians, this new movement, that, they need to maintain elements of the Jewish law, the Torah. One of the big things, referenced was circumcision. And of course, the Johannine community, and I believe this comes from First John, but refers to how these individuals, they were once part of us but then they left us. Well, that would have been a reference to the Gnostics because Gnostic writings are very, very similar to what you find in the Gospel of John and the letters of John. There's a very similar writing style there. So anyway, that's all that we have for the Christianities. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Till then, take care.